Sir, you need to leave right now. This hotel does not serve people who look like you. Those words were not whispered in shame or hidden behind polite excuses. They were spoken plainly, in a steady voice, with the confidence of someone who believed they were stating an accepted truth. The sentence cut across the lobby, sharp and deliberate, and for a moment it seemed to silence even the soft hum of the overhead lights. People looked up from their drinks, their conversations, their phones. A businessman in a dark suit paused mid-step. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat froze halfway through reaching for her purse. That is how moments like this happen. They catch people. They hold them. They force them to decide whether to pretend they did not hear or to let the discomfort settle in. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're listening from right now. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that like button so you don't miss the rest of this story, because what comes next will shock you. Now, let's return to that lobby in the heart of Manhattan, just 3 months after the Aurora Grand opened its doors. The man standing at the counter was Marcus Ellington, though no one here knew it. Tonight, he was using the name Daniel Carter. His coat was plain. His shoes were simple. A small black backpack hung from one shoulder. There was nothing in his appearance to suggest power, wealth, or ownership, and that was intentional. Marcus was the founder and CEO of Ellington Hospitality Group, a chain of 15 luxury hotels spread across the United States. The Aurora Grand was his newest property, the one he had envisioned as the crown jewel of the brand, but in recent weeks, he had read complaint after complaint online, and the pattern disturbed him. Guests of color turned away without clear reason. Immigrants questioned about their reservations. People made to feel unwelcome in a place that claimed to offer world-class hospitality to all. Marcus had built his career on the belief that luxury and dignity were inseparable. You could not claim to offer one if you denied the other. So he decided to come here without warning. No public announcement, no corporate entourage, no hint to the staff that their employer was walking through the door. He wanted to see the truth for himself. He approached the desk and asked for the penthouse suite. The clerk, Sophie Grant, glanced at him quickly, her eyes noting his coat, his shoes, the lack of expensive luggage. She looked back at her screen and said flatly, "That room is not available." Marcus, calm and measured, asked if she could check again. He had already confirmed earlier that the room was empty for the night. Sophie's voice shifted. Cooler now. "It is not available, and we reserve the right to refuse service." The words carried no apology. They were policy as weapon, delivered with finality. Before he could respond, the lobby manager, Clara Hudson, appeared. She was tall, her suit pressed to precision, her steps sharp on the marble. Without introduction, she delivered the sentence that had frozen the air. "Sir, you need to leave right now. This hotel does not serve people who look like you." There it was, unmasked. No invented excuse about a system error. No vague story about a private booking. Just the unfiltered message. You are not wanted here. Clara's eyes did not waver as she signaled to security. Derek Cole, the head of security, was already walking toward them. His voice was low but firm as he said, "We can escort you out now." In the background, a woman's voice, Nancy Walters, a longtime VIP guest, muttered, "This is why standards matter." The words were not aimed directly at Marcus, but they found him all the same. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and turned toward the glass doors. No anger showed on his face, no raised voice. He walked out into the winter night with the same calm he had carried in. Outside. He stopped at the corner and looked back through the glass. Clara was smiling now at a well-dressed couple who had just arrived. Sophie was laughing with another clerk. Derek leaned casually on the counter, chatting with a colleague. Marcus pulled out his phone and made one call. "Janet," he said, when the voice answered, "Bring the car, and bring the folder." There was no hesitation, no request for explanation. Janet Brooks had worked beside him for over a decade. She knew his tone meant something was about to happen, and that, whatever it was, it would not wait. Marcus looked at his watch. 4 minutes. That was all it had taken from the time he stepped through the door to the moment he was removed from his own hotel. He turned toward the street, letting the cold air sharpen his thoughts. 15 minutes. He decided that was all the time they had before the night, and their careers would change forever. Marcus Ellington had not always been a man with power to change a room by walking into it. He had not been born into wealth, or into the polished circles of business where deals are made over quiet dinners and private flights. He came from the south side of Chicago, from a small apartment where the walls were thin and the winters felt longer than they should. His mother worked double shifts as a waitress. His father was gone before Marcus turned 8, and most nights the sound of the elevated train rattling past the window was his lullaby. As a boy, Marcus learned 2 things quickly. People will judge you before they know you, and if you let them, they will keep you exactly where you are. He carried those lessons with him through his teenage years, through long afternoons bussing tables, and through college, where he studied business by day and cleaned offices by night. The hotel industry was not something he had planned for, but life has a way of steering you without asking. His first job in a hotel was on the night shift at a mid-range property near O'Hare Airport. He worked the front desk, the laundry room, and sometimes even handled security when someone called in sick. What stayed with him from those years was not the endless coffee or the late-night travelers. It was the look in the eyes of guests who felt unwelcome, the small hesitations in a greeting, the subtle way a clerk's smile would fade when the person across the counter didn't match their idea of a right guest. Marcus had felt it himself. He remembered walking into a luxury hotel during his sophomore year, dressed in his best shirt and shoes, hoping to meet a mentor in the lobby. Instead, he was intercepted by security and told he was in the wrong place. That memory never left him. Years later, when he founded Ellington Hospitality Group, he built it with a promise to himself: no one would be made to feel out of place under his name. And yet here he was, standing outside the Aurora Grand, having just been removed for the crime of not looking like the guest they wanted. The weight of it settled in his chest as he waited for Janet. She arrived quickly, the company car pulling up to the curb with the quiet efficiency he had come to expect from her. Janet Brooks had been with him since the early days, back when Ellington Hospitality was just one hotel in Chicago struggling to fill its rooms. She had seen the late nights, the close calls, the moments when payroll barely cleared, and she had seen the victories, the awards, the expansions, the day they signed the papers for the Manhattan property they were now standing in front of. Marcus slid into the passenger seat. "You saw the reviews," he said. Janet nodded. "It's worse than we thought," she replied. He opened the folder she had brought. Inside were printouts of complaints, some detailed, some brief, but all telling the same story. Guests turned away without explanation, staff making pointed comments about appropriate clientele, managers defending the refusals as company policy. The language varied, but the meaning was constant. Certain people were not welcome. Marcus closed the folder. "We're going back in," he said. Janet looked at him carefully. "You're going to tell them tonight?" "Yes," Marcus said, his voice steady. "And I'm going to do it in front of everyone. For Marcus." Confrontation was never about volume. He believed in timing, in letting the truth arrive when it could not be ignored. Tonight was one of those moments. As they stepped out of the car, Marcus thought again about the years it had taken to reach this point. He had dealt with prejudice before, in boardrooms where his ideas were doubted until repeated by someone else, in negotiations where the other party assumed he was the assistant rather than the owner. But this was different. This was his own company, his own brand, and the people wearing his name on their uniforms were doing the very thing he had built the business to prevent. Inside the lobby, the same scene played out as before. Clara was at the desk, Sophie beside her, Derek leaning casually nearby. The only difference now was Marcus's approach. He walked in with Janet at his side, his pace unhurried but direct, his eyes set on the center of the room. A few guests turned to look. Clara's expression shifted the moment she saw him, the faint trace of recognition in her eyes, followed by something colder. Annoyance. "Sir," she began, her tone carrying the same controlled dismissal as before. "I believe we already discussed." Marcus held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "We will discuss it again," he said evenly, "but this time, in front of everyone who needs to hear it." He glanced toward Derek. "Call the staff in here. All of them. Now." There was something in his voice that made even Derek hesitate before moving. Sophie's eyes darted between them, uncertain. Janet stepped forward and placed the folder on the counter, her hand resting lightly on it, as if marking the evidence. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a few minutes, every employee on duty would be standing in the lobby, and the conversation that was about to happen would not be one they could forget. This was the moment Marcus had been moving toward since the day he read the first complaint about the Aurora Grand. It was the reason he had walked in alone under a false name, the reason he had let them make their judgment without interference. Now, there would be no denial, no pretense, no hiding behind policy. What happened next would change the way this hotel operated, or it would change who operated it. The gathering began quietly, but the tension was immediate. Employees drifted into the lobby from every corner of the hotel, some still carrying trays, others adjusting their uniforms as they came off tasks mid-shift. The soft murmur of conversations mixed with the faint clink of glass from the bar, where a few guests lingered to watch. Marcus stood near the center of the marble floor, not behind the counter, not in the shadows, but in the open where every set of eyes could find him. Janet was to his right, the folder in her hand. Clara Hudson took her place behind the desk, arms folded, her posture one of authority she believed could not be challenged. Derek Cole stood with his hands clasped in front of him, a wall of muscle and presence, while Sophie Grant shifted uncomfortably in her spot, glancing at the others as if looking for reassurance. Marcus let the silence stretch. He had learned long ago that silence has weight, and when used well, it can make people hear what you have not yet said. Into that silence stepped an unexpected voice. Chris Dalton, a freelance journalist who had been in the bar earlier. He raised his phone slightly, recording, and called out, "Are you about to address what I saw happen here tonight?" The question was loud enough to ripple through the staff. Clara's head turned sharply toward Chris, her expression hardening. "Sir, this is a private matter," she began. But Marcus cut in, his voice calm yet carrying, "Not anymore. What happened tonight stopped being private the moment it happened in front of guests. And from what I can tell, at least one of them is already filming." He nodded toward Chris, who did not lower his phone. The shift in the air was subtle, but real, a recognition among the employees that this conversation might not be contained within these walls. Marcus began speaking, his voice steady, telling them exactly why he was here. He spoke of the complaints, the patterns, the way this location was treating certain guests differently based on appearance, accent, or skin color. He did not raise his voice, but every word was deliberate. He described walking in under a false name, the way Sophie had refused him the penthouse suite without checking, and the words Clara had chosen to remove him from the building. Sophie's gaze dropped to the floor. Derek's jaw tightened. Clara's expression barely changed, but her arms uncrossed as Marcus spoke. Luis Mendoza, the bellman, shifted closer, his eyes fixed on him. When Marcus paused, Luis cleared his throat and said quietly, but clearly, "It's true. I've seen it. More than once." The admission broke the unspoken wall in the room. Another employee from housekeeping spoke up about a family turned away the week before. A server from the restaurant described a guest moved to a corner table after a complaint from another diner. The accounts came in fragments, hesitant at first, then with more certainty as people realized they were not alone in what they had seen. Clara stepped forward, her tone sharp. "These are isolated incidents, taken out of context. We follow company policy." Marcus turned to her, his voice still calm. "I wrote that policy, Clara, and what I've heard tonight is not the policy I created." She started to respond, but he held up a hand, stopping her. Then he did something none of them expected. He reached into the folder Janet held and pulled out the first printed complaint, reading it aloud, then another, and another. Each one detailed a moment of dismissal, of subtle or direct prejudice, of guests made to feel like intruders. The words hung in the air, undeniable. A guest in the bar clapped once, sharply, then stopped as all eyes turned. The sound, brief as it was, seemed to punctuate the point. Clara's posture stiffened further, her face pale but resolute. Derek shifted his weight, looking as though he wanted to be anywhere else. Sophie's shoulders slumped. And still, Chris Dalton kept filming. Marcus looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person in turn. "You may think this is just about one night," he said, "but it's not. It's about the culture you create here every day. And I will not allow the name Ellington to be attached to a place where someone is judged before they are served." The words landed with a quiet finality. There was no applause, no outburst, just a stillness that comes when the truth has been placed on the table. Undeniable and in full view. Marcus let the moment settle, then said, "In a few minutes, I will tell you what happens next. And for some of you, that will mean the end of your time here." Clara's chin lifted slightly at that, a small signal of defiance. Derek folded his arms. Sophie took a step back. Luis glanced at Marcus with something close to gratitude. In the corner, Chris adjusted his phone, ensuring the shot stayed wide. Outside, the city kept moving, taxis passing, sirens in the distance. But inside, the Aurora Grand's lobby had become its own world, holding its breath for what was about to come. Marcus stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle before speaking again. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it now, the kind that comes when patience is no longer the right response. "There's something you need to know," he said, scanning the faces in front of him. "The man you turned away tonight, the man you told did not belong here, was me. And my name is not Daniel Carter. My name is Marcus Ellington. I am the owner of this hotel. I am the founder and CEO of Ellington Hospitality Group, and every person standing here works for me." The words dropped like a heavy stone in still water, for a heartbeat. No one moved. Then the reactions came. Small, but telling. Sophie's eyes widened and her hand came up to her mouth. Luis exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath since Marcus walked in. Derek's jaw set tighter, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Marcus's shoulder. Clara's expression did not crack, but her posture stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. Marcus let the reality sink in. He wanted them to feel the shift, to understand exactly how far out of line they had stepped. "I came here tonight," he continued, "to see for myself if the things I've been reading about this property were true. I hoped they weren't. I hoped I would walk in and find a team living up to the values this company was built on. Instead, I was refused service. I was told I did not belong here. I was escorted out of my own building. He paused, his eyes moving deliberately from Clara to Sophie to Derek. "And none of you knew who I was, which means you have probably done this to others who couldn't come back in with the authority to end it." A murmur went through the gathered staff. It wasn't loud, but it carried the discomfort of people realizing the room had shifted against them. Marcus turned toward Clara. "You had an opportunity to welcome a guest, to show the kind of hospitality this brand is known for, and you chose the opposite. Not because of a booking issue, not because of a security concern, but because you made a judgment the moment you saw me." Clara opened her mouth, her tone sharp and defensive. "Mr. Ellington, I was following protocol." Marcus cut her off with a raised hand. "No, you weren't. I wrote the protocol, and nowhere in it does it say to evaluate a guest by their appearance. Nowhere does it give you the right to decide who belongs based on what they look like." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Marcus turned his attention to Derek. "And you," he said evenly. "You followed her lead without question. You put your authority as head of security behind a decision that violated everything this company stands for." Derek shifted uncomfortably, but stayed silent. Sophie looked like she wanted to speak, but Marcus continued before she could. "And Sophie, you denied a guest the penthouse suite without even checking the system. That is not service, that is bias, and it is unacceptable." The words hung in the air, each one deliberate. Guests who had been quietly watching from the bar and the lounge were now leaning forward, sensing they were witnessing something unusual, the rare moment when the person at the very top was standing in front of his employees, speaking truths that would have consequences before the night was over. Marcus let his gaze sweep the room. This hotel has been open for 3 months. In that time, the number of complaints I've received about discrimination here is higher than any other property in my portfolio. That ends tonight. This is not negotiable. This is not something that will be fixed with a memo or a reminder in the staff handbook. We are going to make changes, and some of you will not be here to see them." Clara finally broke her silence, her voice hard. "You can't just walk in here and throw away years of my work based on one incident." Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but unwavering. "Clara, years of your work have brought us to this point. This is not one incident. This is the night you got caught doing what you've likely done before. The difference is tonight. You did it to the one person who could hold you accountable." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing else. Marcus straightened, his voice carrying across the room again. "In a moment, I will announce the changes that are going to happen here. Starting tonight, if you have anything to say. Now is the time. But understand this. Nothing you say will erase what I experienced here, or what our guests have experienced under your leadership." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Luis Mendoza stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mr. Ellington, I've seen it happen. I've wanted to speak up before, but I didn't think it would change anything. Tonight, I see it can." Marcus gave him a small nod, the first softening in his expression since the meeting began. "Thank you, Luis," he said. Then he looked back to the rest. What happens next is not just about fixing a problem in one hotel. It's about protecting the integrity of an entire brand. And I will do whatever it takes to make sure no guest is ever told again that they do not belong in a place with my name on the door. The room stayed silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Marcus knew the next step would change more than just the evening. It would change careers, reputations, and the way this property was remembered, and he was ready for it. Marcus did not waste another second. "Clara Hudson," he said, his voice even but carrying the weight of finality, effective immediately. "Your employment with Ellington Hospitality Group is terminated." The sentence was delivered without hesitation, like a judge handing down a verdict. Clara blinked once, then twice, as if she had not heard him correctly. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice low but sharp, the kind that cuts through a quiet room. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm entirely serious. You violated company policy, disrespected a guest, and set a standard of conduct that will not be tolerated in my hotels. You are relieved of your duties, and security will escort you from the property tonight." Clara's arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You think you can just walk in here, say a few words, and ruin my career? I've built this team. I've brought in record bookings." Marcus stepped closer, his voice lowering but gaining force. "You've built those numbers on a culture of exclusion. You've filled this hotel by making some guests feel welcome while making others feel like intruders. That is not success. That is a betrayal of what this company stands for." Clara's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Marcus turned to Derek. "Derek Cole, your services as head of security are no longer required. You enforced an unjust action without question, and you did so in a way that reflects poorly on this entire organization. You will hand in your badge and leave the premises tonight." Derek's shoulders squared. "With all due respect, I follow orders. That's my job." Marcus held his gaze. "Your job is to protect people, Derek, not to single them out. Following orders is no excuse for following the wrong ones. You had a choice, and you made the wrong one." Derek's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing more, but his eyes told the story. He was angry, and he would not forget this moment. Marcus turned finally to Sophie. Her face was pale, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "Sophie Grant, you are dismissed from your position as front desk clerk, effective immediately. You denied service without cause and did not follow basic procedures. That decision reflects bias, not policy, and there is no place for that in this company." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Ellington, I didn't mean—" Marcus raised a hand. "Intent does not erase impact. Sophie, the way you treated me tonight is the way you've treated others. That ends now." She bit her lip and looked down, tears threatening to fall, but said nothing more. The room was silent except for the low hum of the lobby's ventilation system. Clara stepped forward, her voice rising now, the mask of professionalism slipping away. "This is a mistake. I have connections in this city. People will hear about this. You're going to regret humiliating me in public." Marcus's voice stayed calm, but there was no softness in it. "The only thing I regret is that it took this long for me to see what was happening in my own property. You created this culture. Clara, you could have chosen to lead with integrity. You chose something else. Now you live with the consequences." Clara glanced at Derek as if to rally support, but Derek kept his eyes on Marcus, silent and rigid. Sophie shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly wishing the floor would open and swallow her whole. Janet stepped forward with a clipboard, handing it to Marcus. He signed 3 termination forms in quick succession, the sound of the pen on paper punctuating the moment like a drumbeat. When he was done, he looked up at the remaining staff. "This is not a warning. This is not a probation. This is a change. From this moment forward, there will be zero tolerance for discrimination in any form in this hotel or any other property with my name on it. Every employee will undergo new training. Every complaint will be reviewed directly by my office. If you can't work under those conditions, you should leave now." His eyes moved deliberately across the room, resting on each person in turn. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened was too fresh, too sharp. Clara finally stepped back from the counter, her heels clicking hard against the marble as she turned toward the door. "You'll hear from my lawyer," she said over her shoulder. But Marcus didn't respond. Derek followed, handing his badge to a junior guard on the way out. Sophie lingered for a moment, then took off her name tag and set it on the counter. her fingers trembling as she walked toward the exit. The doors closed behind them, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness. Marcus turned back to the staff who remained. "What happened tonight is not the end of the story," he said. "It's the beginning of a new one, and you get to decide whether you are part of it." Luis Mendoza stepped forward, his voice steady. "I'm in, Mr. Ellington, and I'll help make sure no one here forgets what happened tonight." Marcus gave him a nod of respect. Around the room, a few others murmured in agreement. Chris Dalton lowered his phone but kept it in hand. The recording light's still on. "This," Chris said quietly, "is going to get people's attention." Marcus looked at him, then at the rest of the staff. "Good," he said. "It should." And with that, the meeting was over, but the ripple from what had just happened was only beginning. The fallout began before the night was over. Chris Dalton's video, raw and unedited, went online less than an hour after he left the Aurora Grand. By morning, it had been shared across every major social platform, tagged with phrases like hashtag Aurora Grand Scandal and hashtag Justice in Hospitality. Millions watched as the clip showed Marcus walking into his own hotel under a false name, being turned away, and then returning to reveal his true identity and fire the people responsible. It was not just the drama of the reveal that gripped viewers. It was the clarity of the injustice. People could hear Clara Hudson's voice saying the words that had started it all. They could see Derek Cole standing behind her, ready to remove Marcus without question. They could watch Sophie Grant refusing to check the booking system before telling him the penthouse suite was unavailable. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Guests who had stayed at Aurora Grand flooded review sites with their own stories, some anonymous, others openly naming themselves. One man wrote about being refused service because his ID was from a different country. A young woman recounted being told she needed to show multiple forms of payment, while the guest ahead of her, a white man in a tailored coat, was checked in with a single credit card. Within 48 hours, major news outlets had picked up the story. Morning shows ran segments with headlines like CEO exposes discrimination in his own hotel and Aurora Grand Scandal sparks nationwide debate. Civil rights advocates praised Marcus for taking swift action, while industry experts called it one of the boldest public interventions by a CEO in recent memory for Clara Hudson. The consequences were immediate and severe. She had built her career in Manhattan's high-end hospitality scene, cultivating an image of control and sophistication. Now, her name was synonymous with exclusion. The video of her words was replayed again and again on television and online. Stripped of context, she tried to claim in later interviews. Calls to her professional network went unanswered. Job leads dried up. Within weeks, she had left the city entirely, telling a former colleague she needed to start fresh somewhere no one knows my name. Derek Cole faced his own reckoning. The state licensing board reviewed the footage and reopened old complaints from his time in Las Vegas, cases that had been dismissed quietly years before. His security license was suspended for 3 years, effectively ending his career in the field, without steady work. He took a job managing security for a construction site on the outskirts of the city, a far cry from the polished lobbies he was used to. Sophie Grant's life shifted in a different way. While she avoided legal trouble, her name was quickly added to informal do-not-hire lists circulating among hotel managers in the area. Screenshots of old social media posts surfaced, some containing casual remarks about problem guests that now took on a harsher meaning. She deleted her accounts, but the damage was done. She moved back in with family in upstate New York, telling friends she wasn't sure she would ever work in hospitality again. For Marcus, the focus was not on the individuals who were gone, but on the culture that remained. He announced the Zero Tolerance, No Excuse initiative across the entire Ellington Hospitality Group. Every employee, from front desk to upper management, would undergo new training on unconscious bias, guest rights, and service equality. Complaints would bypass local managers and go directly to a corporate review panel, half of which would be made up of people outside the company, including past guests. Some investors grumbled privately about the cost, about the optics of drawing more attention to a scandal. Marcus addressed them directly in a shareholder call, his voice steady but firm. If we lose money in the short term to preserve the integrity of our brand in the long term, that is not a loss. That is an investment. The public seemed to agree. In the weeks that followed, letters and emails poured in from guests who had been treated fairly in the past and were glad to see Marcus taking a stand. Some came from unexpected places, competitors in the industry who admitted they admired the decisiveness of his actions, even if they would never say so publicly. The financial picture was mixed. Occupancy at the Aurora Grand dropped sharply in the first month as the scandal dominated headlines. But other properties in the group saw an increase in bookings, with guests saying they chose Ellington hotels specifically because of Marcus's stand in interviews. Marcus avoided gloating or self-congratulation. He spoke instead about the gap between what companies say they value and what they actually tolerate. This wasn't about making an example out of 3 people. He told one reporter, it was about making sure the example they set no longer existed here. Still, the personal cost was real. Marcus received both praise and threats. Anonymous messages accused him of overreacting, of destroying careers over a misunderstanding. He ignored them. What mattered to him was the moment, caught on video, when Luis Mendoza stepped forward in the lobby to say, "I've seen it happen." That was the proof Marcus needed. Not just that the problem was real, but that people inside the hotel had been waiting for someone to act. As the news cycle began to move on, the lasting effects remained. Clara, Derek, and Sophie had each vanished from the Manhattan hotel scene, replaced by new hires who underwent weeks of training before ever greeting their first guest. The Aurora Grand itself had changed in subtle but important ways. Guests were greeted without hesitation. ID checks were conducted uniformly, without extra scrutiny for some and not others. Staff began to speak up when they saw questionable behavior, and in the corner of the lobby, near the elevators, a framed statement from Marcus was mounted on the wall. It read simply, "Hospitality is not a transaction. It is an act of respect, and it is the right of every guest who walks through these doors." Months had passed since that winter night at the Aurora Grand, but the memory of it lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. And in the public conversation that followed, Marcus Ellington had moved forward, but he never allowed the hotel, its staff, or its guests to forget why that night mattered. The zero tolerance, no excuse initiative was no longer a press release or a temporary training program. It had become a living part of the Ellington brand, across all 15 properties, from New York to Los Angeles. The changes were visible. Front desk interactions were warmer and more consistent. Guests from every background spoke of feeling genuinely welcome. Employee surveys showed a measurable shift in how staff viewed their roles, not just as service providers, but as representatives of a standard that valued dignity as much as efficiency. For Marcus, the victory was not in the headlines or the praise that had come his way. It was in the small moments he began to hear about. A guest from another country checking in without being asked for extra documentation. A young couple being offered the best available room without suspicion because they had arrived in casual clothes. A staff member stepping in to correct a colleague before a mistake was made. These moments were not dramatic enough to make the news, but they were the foundation of something lasting. In the months after the scandal, Marcus was invited to speak at industry conferences, leadership summits, and even universities. He told the story the same way each time, plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. "I was thrown out of my own hotel," he would say, pausing to let the sentence land. "And I realized that night that the values on paper don't mean a thing if they don't live in the people wearing your name. His words struck a chord far beyond the hospitality industry. Letters arrived from business owners in other fields, from teachers, from police officers, even from a retired nurse who wrote that she had fought similar battles in her hospital decades earlier. They all shared the same thought. The moment you allow disrespect to become normal, you have already lost something you may never get back. Luis Mendoza's life had changed too. After speaking up in the lobby that night, Marcus promoted him to a supervisory role. Luis took the responsibility seriously, mentoring new hires and sharing his own experiences of working under both good and bad leadership. He became a quiet but steady force in the hotel, a reminder that speaking up, even when it feels risky, can open doors. For Chris Dalton, the journalist whose video had sparked the public reckoning, the story became a career-defining moment. He was offered larger assignments, but he often returned to that night in Manhattan as proof that journalism still had the power to move people and force change. Marcus and Chris crossed paths again at a conference, where Chris thanked him not just for the access, but for handling the fallout with a sense of responsibility rather than vengeance, in private moments. Marcus reflected on the personal cost. The incident had strained relationships with certain investors who were uncomfortable with public confrontations. Some opportunities for expansion were delayed as the company navigated the attention, but every time he weighed those setbacks against the alternative, remaining silent and allowing the culture to continue unchecked, the choice was clear. Silence would have been easier, but it would have been a lie, and Marcus had no interest in building a brand on lies. The Aurora Grand eventually recovered its reputation, not through marketing campaigns or discounted rates, but through consistent action. Guests who had sworn never to return found themselves willing to give it another chance, and when they did, they noticed the difference. Staff who had once hesitated to challenge questionable behavior now did so openly, knowing they had the backing of leadership. The framed statement near the elevators became a quiet landmark, often photographed by guests and shared online as a symbol of what the hotel stood for. One evening, nearly a year after the confrontation, Marcus stood in that same lobby, now filled with the warm hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the quiet rhythm of a place at ease with itself. He thought back to the night he had been told to leave, to the sting of those words, and to the silence that followed before he decided to act. He realized something then. The power of that night was not just in ending something wrong, but in beginning something better. Hospitality, he thought, is not about the building, the decor, or even the service alone. It is about the unspoken promise that when you walk through the door, you will be treated as though you belong, because you do. As he left the lobby, Marcus passed Luis speaking warmly with a guest, Chris's framed photo hanging in the corner from the day of the press conference, and a group of new hires listening intently as a trainer spoke about the company's values. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene. This was the legacy, not the scandal, not the firings, not even the viral video, but the quiet, steady work of living up to the standard they had claimed all along. And as Marcus stepped outside into the cool evening air, he knew that while the fight for fairness in hospitality would never truly be over, the Aurora Grand now stood as proof that change was possible when someone refused to accept that's just how it is. It would not erase the pain of the night that started it all, but it would honor the lesson it taught. Respect must be given without condition, or it is not respect at all. Thank you for listening. If this story mattered to you, please subscribe, like, and share so more people can hear it. Your support means everything. Until next time, take care.